Welcome. Welcome all to this webinar on the political and legal determinants of sexual and reproductive health. And the focus of this seminar is on what happens in African countries in conditions of pandemic lockdown to vulnerable populations, including LGBT community, gays, lesbians, trans people in this context. And our focus will be particularly on Uganda and Mozambique. My name is Siri Gloppen. I'm the director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation, and I'm also the project leader of a project which is called Legal Determinants of Sexual and Reproductive Health in Africa, and where the researchers that you will meet in this session are researchers on the project, along with a lot of other people. And more people will also do research on what happens in the current conditions of lockdown, but also generally how law and politics in these countries affect the lives of sexual minorities, the queer community. And I'm very happy to be able to present to you again, as is often the case at the Bergen Exchanges, a very interdisciplinary team. We have Adrian Duco, a lawyer from Uganda, who's very much engaged in assisting the LGBT community in Uganda generally and in this context, and who has his doctorate in law from the University of Pretoria from last year, and who also just published a book on litigation to promote the rights of sexual minorities in East Africa and in Africa. And we have with me on stage here Carmelisa Rosario, who is an anthropologist from the University of Bergen and the Christian Michelsen Institute and Law Transform. And we have with us from Peru, Camila Gianella, who is a psychologist and a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute. And Carmelisa and Camila have been conducting a survey with the LGBT community in Mozambique. 2 surveys, one during lockdown, one before, and they will tell us about their findings a little bit later. So although it's just the 2 of us here on stage, we're a rich panel. And I will start by giving the word to Adrian from Kampala to give us a sense of what has happened there in the past months.
Thank you so much, Siri, and I'm glad to be speaking at this version of the Bergen Exchanges. I'm glad they are able to take place in this new normal. So I'm speaking to you from Kampala, and I'm in my office. So the statistics of Uganda as regards COVID-19 are a little bit, how can I say, are they? Well, of course, many people have issues about how much we are reporting, how much we're not reporting, how much we are testing, but we have 1,603 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Of these, 1,165 have recovered, and we've only recorded 15 deaths. And the death only started about 10 days ago, something like that. We didn't have death for a long time. So, of course, there's a lot of many people feel that this is not real. There's no COVID-19 for real. It's not happening. But also the fact that COVID-19 came without of restrictions on what people could do. Lots of businesses were closed. People felt like this is something the government is coming up with without giving us options. And that became an issue. So those are the statistics of COVID-19. The government response has been prevent. So they have been trying to prevent COVID-19 from entering the country. That was the first line of looking at it. So they closed the airport, they closed the borders apart from trucks carrying goods coming into the country. And then they stopped public transport. And then they stopped private transport, meaning that for a long time, many of us couldn't actually move. So they didn't necessarily have to local workplaces, but if you couldn't have public transport, you couldn't have private transport, basically you couldn't get so much anywhere. We have a curfew which starts at about 9 p.m. in the night and ends at 6:30 a.m. in the morning. So we're not supposed to move at night, although ideally many people actually remain moving because Kampala at that time is full of traffic jams. So there's no way you're going to get home at 9 p.m., even if you leave work as early as possible. And then the other thing that they do is arrests. So instead of taking the medical approach to COVID-19, Uganda seems to have taken the, how can I say, the military approach to COVID-19. So we do arrest people as much as possible for COVID-19 related violations. Not just arrest them, we also beat them up as they are going about their businesses. We arrest them, beat them up, throw them into police cells, also throw them in jail. At the same time, our courts practically shut down during this period, during the lockdown period. Courts practically shut down. Even up to now, they have not actually completely resumed how to operate. So you have a situation where people are being picked up and being thrown in jail, and then at the same time, people are being, at the same time, people are being arrested at the same time the courts are not working, meaning that we're most likely to have much more congestion. So again, Uganda's approach was decongest every place. So we closed schools, we closed churches, those have not yet opened, we closed bars. At the same time, we are busy putting more people in jail and putting more people in police cells. So that's the situation. Right now, private cars can move, public transport can move, but it has transport fares have doubled because you are supposed to have spacing, social distancing in the cars, in the taxis that carry people. That means if you're going to do social distancing, then they're going to charge you twice the amount of money that trip would have cost. So it's still very expensive for people to move around in using public cars. So that's the situation and how it stands, generally speaking, for everyone in the country. So that brings me to the question of LGBT persons who always get affected much more by these things. We all know vulnerability. This kind of restrictions dig into the vulnerability that's already on the ground. So LGBT people are vulnerable, and they become more vulnerable when you put in positions like this. I always ask people to tell me what the meaning of staying at home means. So the government encourages us to stay at home. What does stay at home mean for LGBT people? Which home are they going to stay at? You have to stay at a home if you have a home. They don't have homes to speak about. You are telling them to stay at home. Don't go anywhere. Stay at home. That's number one. Number two, even if they have homes, these homes are also centers of violence for most LGBT people. If you go home to live with your family, with your father, your mother, your brothers and sisters, there's also violence that's going to happen in that home because of your sexual orientation and gender identity, which for many, they may not know it until you go back home. And then, apart from people now becoming, having nowhere to go, people resorted to going to shelters, LGBT-specific shelters. What happened in the shelters is the government started raiding the shelters and closing them down. So the government has closed down, basically they raided one shelter, which basically had to close. Arrested the people who were there, there were over 23 persons, and then charged them with doing a negligent act that could spread infection of disease, put them on a truck, the back of a truck that carries sand, and took them to court, and then they were remanded to prison. They spent over 60 days. Even us as lawyers, we couldn't have access to them for all those days, except that around that day, the 42nd day, we got a court order allowing us to go and access our clients. And a few days after we had access to them, they told us what we're going through. They were released. So that's the situation, that you go from home. When they tell you to go home, you go home, but home is not home because there is a reason why you left home in the first place. You go back to that place, and then when you go to a shelter, which you now call home, the police arrest you, saying that you are doing something like it causes infection of disease. And what's this something? This is being over 20 people in a house. It's nowhere in the law that you cannot be 20 people in a house, but they will arrest you because you are gay. So for me, I summarize this situation as being that COVID-19 has instead further criminalized same-sex relations. So apart from the normal, usual criminal laws that we have, Section 145 of the Penal Code, criminalizing carnage against the order of nature, we are adding another provision somehow, and the provision is called COVID-19. So because they're going to use the excuse of COVID-19 to police your sexuality. So if you are gay, they don't charge you with homosexuality. They don't charge you with any any charge that relates to your sexuality, they charge you with doing a negligent act, like to spread the infection of disease. That's what we are saying increasingly. So that's criminalization. So whoever had a group of people they were targeting before, they now have the perfect excuse to go and arrest them. Of course, if you add that, if you leave that alone, the issue of arrests and people being dumped into prisons, then we go to the issue of access to services, sexual and reproductive health services. Most of the medical centers, most of the hospitals are now for COVID-19, as in there's a crisis in the country. You're looking at COVID-19, so you cannot bring your issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. You cannot come here for services when that's happening. But even if the services were actually available, how do you access these services? How do you get to town to get these services? How do you get to the hospital to get these services? Transport right now is so high. Before there was no transport whatsoever. And they didn't care about who was getting ARVs, who was getting whatever. You couldn't just get to town to get anything. And the hospitals wouldn't come to you. You have to go to the hospitals. So now in light of COVID-19, people have nowhere to go. Others move from areas where they are staying. No one cares about access to service. No one cares about how they're supposed to get access to the services they were getting before COVID-19. And of course, if you add this to unemployment, already unemployment is rife among the LGBT population because generally you don't have enough qualifications, you can't work here because you are gay, so you're fired from your job all the time. Now you add that to general unemployment caused by COVID-19. So many people lost their jobs. So even those, what small jobs they are doing in salons, for example, salons have not been open for a long time. And many other areas like that where people go and earn a living, those places have been closed down. So that means that many people don't have a source of income. That means they also lack food and basic nutrients. They also lack a way of getting to town and getting their medicines because now they don't have money for transportation. So we've received many applications here from LGBT shelters, LGBT organizations, LGBT individuals, asking us to help them, to support them in terms of access to food, just food, and maybe even shelter. So of course, we are lawyers, and that's quite a conundrum right there, that lawyers are supposed to provide legal services. So we're supposed to give you legal services, not food aid. However, we have come to rethink, and we've spoken to our donors about this, that we have to rethink how we do. This is a time of crisis, and you can't say, I'm just going to get you out of the police station without you having anywhere to stay, without you having access to medication. So the group we got out of prison, 20 people, when we got them out of prison, we had to take them and give them accommodation. We had to find them treatment, pay for their treatment and pay for their transport, which is something that we never used to do before. So these are challenges that are being brought about by the COVID-19 situation. And also the other thing is that no one pays attention. So the issue of paying attention, people were caring, they would pay attention, they would wonder what's going on. Why is the community being affected like that? Nowadays, there's much little attention that's being paid to LGBT persons and organizations because now the bigger focus is on COVID-19. So you can now do whatever you want with LGBT people, beat them up, practice Tokyo, do Tokyo on them like they did for those 20 people. One of them was burnt with a piece of burning wood between the thighs for being gay. We've taken them to court, and court the other day issued a warrant of arrest for the mayor of the area where they were from, and also for a prison officer who did that. But that's not enough. The fact that the torture couldn't be prevented, it has already happened. Regardless of what the court says, the torture has already happened on you, is enough to show that the situation is not at all good. So basically, that's how COVID-19 has affected LGBT people that we serve in Uganda, but also us as a service provision organization, we've had to change and reflect and see how to do work. We had to resort to unconventional ways of doing work in Uganda. I know in Norway probably may see bicycles as a conventional way of doing work. In Uganda, that's business, but bicycle roads, to be able to access our clients, to be able to access jail and other places. We had to resort to motorcycles. So we now have a fleet of motorcycles that we use to give access to people. And at one time, we even had to use a sand truck because at that time, trucks were allowed to move on the road. We had to resort to lawyers now sitting in sand trucks to go and deliver legal aid services, meaning that the way you deliver services has to change. That means that also from the health perspective, those who deliver health services, they also have to change the way they work and be able to give services that are attuned to what the people want at that time. So that's the situation right now in Uganda. Let me hope it's very different from what's happening in Mozambique and other places, as we're going to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you so much for giving this account. I forgot to say that Adrian Duco is the Executive Director of HARAP, the Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum in in Uganda, in addition to being a scholar. And Adrian, if you have, I have the copy of your book at home, so I forgot to bring it today. But if you have a copy of your book there, you should keep it for the next time I get back to you and show it, because it's a very good book and it's available online, free of charge. But I wanted I want to open for a couple of questions to Adrian now, both from the audience here at Bergen Global, but also for the audience online. And if you're online, you can, at the webinar, you can either write your question in the chat or Q&A, or you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, you will be promoted so that you can actually ask your question directly. But we have a first question from Lisa Ragnar in the audience, who is also part of the same research project.
So thank you so much, Adrian. I wish you could have been here with us to to have a real proper Bergen Exchange experience. But so I was really struck by your term. The Ugandan government's response is not a medical response, but sort of a militant or like a military response. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. And I wonder if you could reflect on how this approach sort of likens or is similar or dissimilar to the Ugandan government's response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. To what extent do you see kind of like they're using the same playbook, or do you see something different? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? No. So then, Adrian, then you can just respond to Lisa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa, for that question. Of course, the military approach to public health is interesting. The fact that you can police people into all sorts of things, that you have to force them to do things. You have to shoot. We've had a number of murders actually happening within the community, people being shot for not following COVID-19 orders. And we've had so many things happening that to the extent that even leaders have actually been beaten by local defense unit members. So which led to Museveni, who is the president and has been president for 30 whatever years, I don't know how long, and is maybe life president forever. He had to withdraw the troops from the streets because it had become quite too much. And the vulnerable people are the ones who face the wrath of this. There's a time I was driving home beyond curfew hours in my car, and I met a group of people who had been arrested for defying curfew hours. And this is interesting. A group of poor people on the road, they had been made to lie down, and the police were beating them. And when I came and the police saw the lights of my car, they practically moved the police car out of the way and showed me where to pass and go. I'm like, okay, this, of course I thought, should I stop? And I'm like, hey, you may stop and they beat you up too. But if you look at the kind of inequality, just because I'm in a car, that's very different from a person who is walking on the street. That's why these kind of measures much more affect the poor than they do affect the others. Now, if you compare this to the approach that the Uganda government took towards HIV/AIDS, I think the Uganda government's initial approach to HIV/AIDS, mainly as regards the general population, was more of a public health approach, where the government encouraged ABC, abstinence, be faithful, and use condoms quite well. And we saw the rates of HIV coming down during that period. Of course, right now they're going up again because the government's model has kind of changed. Now it's more like be faithful is the campaign because of the moralistic aspects of it. So be faithful. You have one partner, be faithful. That's what they're encouraging, instead of encouraging people to use condoms, which is perhaps much more practical. So, and also if you think about it in terms of HIV treatment for LGBT people, provision of services for the most marginalized LGBT people, sex work and the others, the government has for long shied away from focusing on key populations. Until of recent, when of course you saw the Ministry of Health try to set up clinics where they are going to deal with HIV amongst the key populations. But before, that was not the approach. Southern State was the approach instead for LGBT people. The approach initially was militaristic. Basically, it was criminal law. So in around 1990, we amended the law when HIV had been discovered here, blah blah. We had our penal code amended to provide for life imprisonment instead of 14 years imprisonment for homosexuality. That was, so from 14 years imprisonment to life imprisonment. And the reason was, hey, these gays are the cause of HIV. So that was kind of militant. And as we've seen over time, arrests have been done and they don't care about HIV status and whether you are taking ARVs or not, they'll still put you in. But that's not for the mainstream HIV struggle like this, HIV fight like this has been for COVID-19. So there lies the differences. Of course, the approach and the effect is the same. If you criminalize, what happens is that there will be more discrimination. What happens is that people will be pushed underground for HIV. At the same time, COVID-19, if you use the same approach, you are going to find that you are going to violate much more rights, than trying to prevent the pandemic and stopping it.
Thank you so much, Adrian. If we don't have any more questions for now, there are many things I'd like to ask you, but I think we'll first go to Mozambique. But if you come to realize that you have questions for Adrian, you can still ask them later or write them in the chat, and we'll do it in the general discussion afterwards. So I think we'll go to Camila first in Peru and hear more about the work that you did in Mozambique and the findings that you have.
Thank you, Siri. Okay, but Carmelisa is there, I think. We can share the presentation, and Carmelisa, please just say things when I am not addressing the things correctly. Okay, so what I am going to talk about is a study that we did with Carmelisa in Mozambique as part of the project that Siri mentioned before, that Adrian is also part, and so as probably some of you know, Mozambique is now portrayed as a country in sub-Saharan Africa that has hard measures against the LGBT community, and it's also portrayed as a case of equal rights and more progressive approach to the LGBT community. So we have some concerns about that. We think that there is it is true that there is no such a hard criminalization against LGBT people in Mozambique. There is more like a structural discrimination going on there, and this discourse that portrays Mozambique as a more progressive, in a way, could be just covering this discrimination. So what we did with Carmelisa is to think on and to design and apply a work and qualitative interviews and a survey among LGBT people in Mozambique to ask about some issues related to violence, related to access to healthcare services, and we did that first survey last year between August and September, so pre the situation of the COVID-19. And what we found that was for us was shocking is the level of violence against the LGBT people in general, and in a way the normalization of this violence. So in the qualitative interviews, we for example, in the case of the lesbians, we interviewed them, and things were, so they were not reporting this as violence because of the gender identity, but it's just like the normalization of the violence there. And one place that we found that was the place where violence were taking place was the homes. So the violence from the relatives, the violence from the parents, uncles, and different relatives. So when the COVID situation came and we saw that Mozambique was as many of the country following the instructions to lock down, that was the main to take the measure. We say, okay, what does this mean for people that already have reported that the violence comes from inside the homes, as they are going to get locked down in their homes. Another issue that we found in the survey that we found last year is that it's true that there is a lot of the people in the informal market in Mozambique working in the informal market, but in the case of the LGBT people, this is the main source of income, so daily income, and we were thinking like, okay, so you cannot go there outside to work and you don't have any social security, what this means for you. And so we apply we make the contacts, and we work on applying a survey in August. And we ask some questions related to the access to violence and housing conditions and how the COVID-19 has impact on them, and just to check if the things that you were aware of were more or less there or not. Or yeah, to test that questions that we have in mind. And so Mozambique started with the lockdown in April, and we made the interview in May, no, Carmelisa? So there was 1.5 months after the lockdown start. And what we found in this survey is that for the people that were saying, okay, some of them already moved back to their parent house, so it's really quick, 1 month, yeah, people have to, not the majority, but some of them already have to move to the relative and parent house. And there were concerns regarding food. So, and that is interesting because it's when you ask for them if you have lost your job, if you're in the informal market, you are not going to report that you lost your job because your income generation and you just juggle between things and try to. But there were a concern that the food was getting more expensive, and they were afraid of not getting enough food. So they were already struggling with access to food, and also the thing that as other people come to the houses, so it's just a lot of people is just losing housing, and then for the families are getting together. And when you ask for what are the most difficult instructions in a way, recommendations on the COVID is to stay at home. So, and that have a sense, already, as Adrian said before, and what we found last year is that home is a place where most of the violence is happening. For them, stay at home was something that they were struggling. So it's a thing that for them is the most difficult to deal with. And of course, if the homes are already receiving more people, this issue of the social distancing is, for them, is almost impossible to follow at home. No? So I think that if you assess this through the other information at the national level in Mozambique, probably these concerns are. I try to follow the report of the World Food Program on access to food in Mozambique during the COVID, at the same time that we were collecting the data, and the concerns to access to food was not so evident for the general population, I would say. But probably it's because of this population have their own vulnerabilities, they were already concerned. And that was the picture in May, and now the lockdown has continued, so we don't know how is this group of people now. No? So yeah, I am going to stop here, and then probably Carmelisa can add some stuff. And thank you.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much. So before I give the words to you, Carmelisa, I just want to sort of bring together a couple of the things that Camila said and Adrian said. Of course, in this project, one of the things that we look at are countries with really different laws. So as you learned from Adrian and Camila, the laws are very different in Uganda and Mozambique. And they have been moving in different directions in Uganda and Mozambique. So Adrian was saying that over the last years and decades, the laws criminalizing homosexuality in Uganda, which were in place from colonial times and strict, have been made harsher. And there was also a debate that many of you might be aware of some years back that started about a decade ago in Uganda to introduce the death penalty for homosexuality, which politicized the issue a lot. So so although in the end the law wasn't changed, it was changed and then it was nullified by the Constitutional Court. It is sort of always on the agenda, and it is a much stricter law. So we're trying to look at the effects of that. In Mozambique, it was a very different experience because the law was liberalized in Mozambique. And then the question is, does that make it, what difference does that make on the ground? Does it make it does it make all good, or doesn't it? And also in Uganda, is it only, even if the law wasn't changed to introduce the death penalty, did this politicization actually make a difference? And it's interesting what Adrian is saying that the courts in some cases might in the end punish those who transgress the law as it is, because you're not allowed to torture people, even if they're gay in Uganda. The general thrust of the idea that these people are criminals, that it's free for all, that the sort of the discussion around the law has changed the atmosphere and made people more vulnerable. So these are some interesting things that I think that we're now hearing from both Adrian's experience and from your survey, that the working operations of the law is complicated. So maybe you could just say something more about that.
Absolutely, Siri, and I think that it's exactly this is what change does it make to have a liberalization of the law? And one of the things that we had early on when we started this and we started investigating the workings of the law and the impact and how political, or how was it politicized in Mozambique, one of the things that we heard from the LGBT activists was that the only thing that the law did in Mozambique was take out 2 articles that weren't actually used. So there was no working within the society. There was no change within how people behaved socially that would make any true difference. There was no particular inclusion of, for example, of non-discrimination or punishment of discrimination, which would have helped much more. And what it happens then is that the results are insidious, because if you go and complain, people will say, well, but there is no crime, and the society doesn't discriminate, the law is good, so why are you complaining? And one of the things that strikes me is we are also a democracy, which is a bit different from Uganda. Despite them having elections, we have elections that technically change things, not the party, but certain things. We are a democracy, but some of the workings of this militarization of COVID are very similar. This inequality of poor people being targeted. So even if LGBT people are not specifically targeted, but by the need of being outside, by the need of being vulnerable already, they would be among those which would be targeted by these punishments, corporal punishments, being imprisoned. And of course, when you have overall social discrimination or social negative thoughts about LGBT people. And here, of course, trans women would be among the most vulnerable because they engage, for example, in prostitution as a form of having their revenue. Then, of course, their encounter with the police, with the military state, with the corporal punishment already existed before COVID. Now it would be even more, because those who are being more punished are those who are selling, for example, drinks, or opening these little shacks of food and drinks. And these are the needs that a lot of people have said that they really need to cope with having to stay at home, to cope with not having revenue or having decreasing revenue, these entertainment spaces, which were there before and now are shuttered, these are the places that have been targeted by the police and the military. And of course, you being outside later, you being outside, there's a lot of women who are going out and selling in the streets. And then we have a lot of videos circulating in social media of these things being apprehended. So people are pushed further down into poverty, even when they attempt. Technically, there is a time for selling. Markets technically are open as long as you respect the social distancing and the rules. But of course, these those in informal market, those in the streets, those are not contemplated. Those are people who are being targeted. These are the poorest people. And even a small island that we have right in front of Maputo, which has no more than 3,000 people. They are arresting people there for not complying with the COVID restrictions. And I'm thinking, but it's so easy to have social distancing there. How are they not complying? And it is this thing that they need to be at home. If we add to that, as Camila was saying, that the most violent place for LGBT people is the home, is the space where the family is. If they haven't been able to create a sort of stable environment for them to be a safe, stable environment, because a lot of the people in the LGBT community are mobile. They keep moving from space to space until the space where they are is no longer safe. They move in with other relatives, with friends, sometimes friends who are not really aware of their situation, and then they become aware, and then they need to move again. So there is this high instability, as Adriana also said. So also in Mozambique, where is home? Where should they go to? Who is going to take them? If the people they are going to move in with are also vulnerable, also don't have what to give them, there is no protection, there is no legal protection, even though technically they are not a discriminated group. But their underlying vulnerability, in which the state is punishing highly the poorer, the vulnerable, those facing violence or structural violence, they are amongst these people. If I could add, at the same time, what is happening is that the activism towards protection of LGBT people is still highly active. There are a lot of changes happening. The leadership at Lambda, which used to be the only organization, now has changed. The leader has moved on and now is opening a new group for protection and human rights protection. And the trans women have opened, or the trans people have opened their own chapter and their own organization. So there is a lot of dynamic that is going on, and I think that people are trying to move within these insidious negative effects of the law, which hasn't brought a lot of improvements actually so far.
So thank you, Camila. I just think it's interesting. I mean, there are many, many interesting things there. One of the things that is coming from all three of you in a way is that in the context of the pandemic, there is the pandemic laws and pandemic regulations are used to target. It's in a way it criminalizes poverty in all of these, in both contexts, both in Mozambique and in Uganda. In Uganda, from what you're saying, Adrian, it seems to me that it's also criminalizing in a different way homosexuality, that it is sort of directly targeting LGBT hostels or shelters, LGBT organizations in a particular way, or maybe, and I want you to say something about that, maybe activism more generally, maybe also LGBT activism. But it seems to me that in Mozambique that is different, that it's not the government, so the law matters. So in my interpretation, the law matters from what you're saying, because it's more sort of criminalization of poverty generally. And I wanted, and also it's not criminalization of activism in the same way. And it's not sort of targeting LGBT organizations particularly. So I'm just saying that there seems to me to be some differences. I also wanted to ask you, because it wasn't quite clear to me, are you seeing increased levels of violence against LGBT people in the families, sort of from the first survey to the second, or is it too early, or aren't you really seeing it? And the second one is, many of these, and that relates to my first comment, that of course many of these issues will be like the concern for nutrition is a general concern probably for poor people in Mozambique. So could you say something about that? Do you have reason to believe, and that also goes to you, Adrian, are these groups particularly vulnerable? And with that, and which other groups would also be sort of particularly vulnerable in that context? So I'm going to give the word to you first, Adrian, and then if there are other comments or online or here, please just raise a hand or write your comment.
Thank you so much, Siri. I see from what Camelisa and Camila have said, Mozambique may be different, but it's again not so different. As in, the things happening in most of our countries are almost similar and the same, regardless of the overlying legal structure. And the thing she talked about before, like Camila spoke about, around that Mozambique may not be criminalizing homosexuality. We are criminalizing homosexuality. At the end of the day, you find that a number of things being done by different actors still put homophobia going around in both countries. In Uganda, of course, with a criminal law in place, it becomes much more easy to politicize everything. You can easily use the justification of the law and then be able to do things. That's what the mayor did when he was arresting a group of gay people, because he didn't just like them. He didn't just like gay people. He had the excuse of COVID-19 to use, and so he went off on a tangent. These are people who are gay, but for him, he was quite clear that they are gay, that's why he's attacking them. But when they go to the police station, the police was like, hey, you are being charged for COVID-19. They even it took a whole police spokesperson to go to the police station and tell these people that you are not being charged with any offense related to homosexuality. You are being charged with offenses related to COVID-19. And there was a reason why he was trying to emphasize that. He didn't want this kind of response from human rights activists that this is about their sexual orientation and gender identity. But this is what it was about. It was about their sexual orientation. It was about their gender identity. It was never about COVID-19. So that's why I said that COVID-19 is used as the perfect excuse to further criminalize homosexuality. It's used as the perfect excuse to deny. In Uganda, we had a situation of denial of food of people based on their sexual orientation and their work. That you're not the kind of people who should get food relief given by the government because, hey, who are you? You are gays, you don't matter. That happened. And so you couldn't find that food relief couldn't be given to people who are known to be gay. And of course, you add that to the attacks that I spoke about earlier around the attacks on shelters where LGBT people would be. Apart from the shelter that was raided, other shelters were visited, visited by the police. About 3 other shelters had visitors from the police coming to visit you and check on you every time. What that means is that, you know what, run as fast as you can. They're going to raid you. And that's what happened. Many people started disbanding the shelters and others having the poor move to different places, others having to let them go back home. All these are the kind of effects that we see of this so-called further criminalization. You use every justification to further criminalize. You want to leave out the aspect of LGBT or the aspect of homosexuality, and you bring to the fore the aspect of COVID-19. So you use COVID-19 as something to hide your real intention. So, and also that tags into the question you asked about vulnerability. Are these groups much more vulnerable than other groups? Yes, because of the vulnerabilities, that the underlying vulnerabilities that they already have. Already people are waiting for when they can get you. And they have the perfect opportunity. COVID-19 is here. At the same time, that poverty, which is already existing, the lack of enough education, all the things combine to make you someone who basically would not survive this whole COVID-19 period. If you're not working, you have nothing to bring in, you have no home to stay with, practically you are almost gone, because at least other people can have a social net to fall up to. You don't have a social net to follow. So sex workers, and that was another group that really suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's the thing, that your work in Uganda, we had this thing about truck drivers. It was the new song. Truck drivers are the problem in Uganda, blah, blah, blah. They are all importing COVID-19 from Tanzania and Kenya, which are bad law, bring it to Uganda. So we should deal with these truck drivers. And the sex workers we are seen as the clients of the truck drivers. Even the president had to speak about these girls on the street who relate with truck drivers. And so sex workers couldn't be on the street at night because the streets were closed and they were being policed. At the same time, sex workers could not even come anywhere near truck drivers, but even if they didn't, still they were known to be related with truck drivers, making them subject to stigma from the community about COVID-19. So you would suspect truck drivers to have COVID-19, but also suspect the sex workers to have the COVID-19. So again, vulnerability, layers of vulnerability being added to layers of vulnerability. You can't get HIV services because you don't have the money. You can't have anywhere to go, which they call home. You can't stay home because there's no home to stay. And you can't stay home and starve to death. You know, you have to be able to stay home and eat something. If you stay home and starve because no one is giving you food relief, then what kind of staying home is that? So for me, I see all those things as interconnected. We are using epidemics to fulfill our own agendas. We're using epidemics to pick and choose who can get food relief, who can get access to HIV services, who can get access to whatever kind of treatment. That's what we are doing, using COVID-19 as a new tool to control sexuality. But the sex workers not having food, in many cases in Uganda, they had to go and fight for the food. And there was one instance where they threatened to review politicians who go and buy sex. And in those places, they were given food after they threatened the politicians. But it had to take such measures for people to be recognized just as human, that I need to have food if I'm to survive. And so that's the biggest challenge. And COVID-19 has not yet given an end date. It has no sell by date, end by date, meaning that these are not simply things that happened in the past. These are things that are happening today, and they are continuing to happen. And the question is, where are we headed? Right now in Uganda, we've not had any policies, any guidelines, any consideration whatsoever that you hear where LGBT people, sex workers are being considered to be part of the COVID-19 response. You don't hear that happening anywhere, meaning that even further planning, the distribution of masks, the distribution of food, all those things may not affect these particular groups because they're invisible. The concept of invisibility. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Adrian. I want to go to Camila, if you're still online. No.
I am.
You are. Good.
Yeah. Well, we have not, with the survey, we have not an increase on probably that is because of how we put the questions in the survey. So we I don't think that was so sensitive to that. Probably we need to think on that. We decide to make this kind of service in other settings to have more better questions. But as I say, we knew from before that this was the situation, that this is a place where a lot of violence happens to them. And we know that, as Adrian say, and Carmelisa, stay at home is the most difficult thing to follow. But from the result that we have now, we don't see like an increase on the number of people that is reporting violence. But I think that it also have to do with how we present the question. Because in the other survey, we have more questions to try to ask for this in different ways. I mean, this was much more restricted because we were asking also for food security, more on job and that. So, yeah.
I also think it has to do with perception of violence, because violence in Mozambique is not necessarily physical. And when it is physical, is usually shameful or associated to shame, like rape. And so it's not reported. If it's not a shameful violence, shameful violence is not reported, and so the other kind of violence that would be beatings and would be recognized as violence don't really exist. What exists most is psychological violence with insults or silence, expelling from the house, withdrawing support, monetary support. These things are already very common. And so there is no report of increase of these kinds of types of violence that are at the same time not recognized as violence. They are very normalized, as Camila said. There are many settings that we would definitely consider domestic violence, psychological violence, but people suffering them, they don't think, because they are not physically beaten, they don't end up in the hospital. And if they get depressed, they don't recognize that they are depressed. They have feelings of suicide or something like that. They don't associate it with this continued micro or sometimes not so microaggression. So I think in relation to potential increase in violence, there is also a difficulty of reporting. So as Camila said, we had the challenge that we had to do this on the phone, so we couldn't have a lengthy questionnaire, and we couldn't sort of beat around the bush to figure out whether there were things that were not being reported that we might consider violence, for example. And so this also adds to the difficulty of perception. So the challenge of doing survey under COVID without being there with the people and the perception of what constitutes violence, I think, are the two things.
Are these things that you have more data on from the first survey?
Yeah, we have of what kind of violence exists. We have a lot of data, and this is how we realize that most of the violence happens at home. But there is a lot of violence from police already from before. So as Adrian says, when the state is already has this thing against you. So yes, it is true that COVID targets the poor, but if you're poor and LGBT and the state, or not the state, the agents of the state, not the state as this overall structure, but agents of the state which have this negative perception of you. For example, if you engage in sex work, as trans women often do, not all of them, but often they do, then you are, you do get these perceptions of, okay, you're transmitting COVID. This is why this whole, the places where you sell drinks and, these entertainment places are particularly targeted because there is this perception of, this is where COVID.
Yeah. And I think that goes also to what you were saying, Adrian, that sex workers as such, whatever. So that is also, of course, so do you have any sense of whether trans sex workers would be differently targeted?
Definitely.
Really?
Yes. Because they are feared.
Yeah. I think that it's also a thing that, as Adrian was saying and Carmelisa was saying, that it's more like a structural violence, and if you don't have the data and you don't collect the data of, for example, how many transgender women have COVID, so we don't have them in the reports. So we don't know is it because of they are more vulnerable for to have to be in the streets, they don't have a formal work, they are in poverty. Is the cases are going up among the community, they are invisible for the state. So there are different ways that they are more vulnerable, and with this data that we have, probably is just to make it more visible, to say they are special conditions that they are dealing with, that we cannot just to say poor people is affected. Yeah, poor people is affected, but probably we need also to collect that down, and what is these people and why these people is more affected, and not just say Mozambique, and so to be more aware of that, we need to disaggregate the data and to show who is the people that is being affected by COVID and how, and what are the determinants that are putting these people in more risk.
Good point. I have a question from Tedjun Osterwald from the chat, and he asks about what about international, non-domestic NGOs? Well, working with sort of LGBT organizations who normally are interacting in these countries, are they present? Do they have a role? What is their role in this context? Do you want to start, Adrian?
Yes, of course, difficult to respond for them, I would say for the national NGOs. But yes, they always play the role that they're supposed to play, that is in supporting the domestic NGOs to be able to do certain things. And I think for now, for me, it will be just more of a call rather than saying what they're doing, a call to do more, to respond much more, to be much more flexible in terms of support, funding, and speaking out. So many NGOs, many international NGOs were supporting us in our case against the government regarding the Tokyo, and they also that went through, they spoke out with different issues, different people had meetings and conferences where spoke about this, and that's a good thing. At the same time, we also need them on the ground. You know, we need the support on the ground. We need right now to start channeling support to the ground, to support, to plug in the gaps where the government is failing to plug in. I don't think you're going to make the Uganda government change very soon its policy on LGBT people and whether it can include them or not. The Uganda government can't basically even distribute masks, and you're talking about them distributing food effectively and helping those who are basically most at risk. That's not going to happen. And if it's not going to happen, then how do we make it happen? How do we provide this kind of support? And so on this, we look out to international NGOs, non-domestic NGOs, to basically help us out. So support, people understanding that even if, for example, Donor Act is understanding that, you know what, money now needs to be channeled towards food aid, not just legal aid. Like I said in the beginning, that you can't give legal aid without food aid. At this time, that would be kind of, I don't know how you'd be thinking to kind of think of only giving legal aid and never think about giving food aid or accommodation support for such people. And our donors ought to be able to understand that, appreciate it, and also do that. And also kind of raise more funds to support activists here, to support NGOs here, to support people on the ground, because I think that is what this time calls for. It's a time of crisis, it's a time where we need also some support to come through, because the alternative would have been the government, but that government won't come in.
Thank you, Adrian. What about Mozambique? Are these international organizations active at this time?
So the organizations that are supposed to support LGBT people are funded by international organizations, both NGOs and also states. In response to what you said, that the law matters because activism is possible, it is possible, but they are still not registered. They need to receive through other organizations because they cannot say that they are organizations that to support same-sex people. So they're not put in prison, but life is not made easy. But still, yes, we are happy that something is possible. But again, the law didn't do, or the state didn't do anything before either. And even if the law had remained the same, our suspicion is that it would probably be like this as well. This is the suspicion that we have. Now, this support, and I think Adrian has a very good point, if there were money distribution there's more emphasis put on masks than on food, even though everyone has been talking about food security and they are concerned about food security, but there hasn't really been action towards this. And my suspicion is that some of the people in the LGBT community would not be able to access. One is for lack of information, not being connected, not knowing where to go. Maybe people who are connected to these associations or activists, they would be informed, but these are just the minority. And so along with other poor people, it would be very difficult for them to know how to access these benefits, but there hasn't been talk about this. People haven't found, and I'm not sure why, because at the same time, it is a big issue, this food insecurity. Another consequence that the organizations have been worried about, and the health ministry is trying to do something about, but just with conscientization, is many of the people in the LGBT community, and the reason why this activism is geared towards is health, and specifically HIV/AIDS. And a lot of people are not going to the health facilities because they are afraid of COVID. They don't want to get COVID, so they don't go and get their medicine. They don't go for other diseases. And so there is a drop in people getting their AIDS assistance. And so this is a strong concern. The ministry has been trying to do something. There is this health concern that has been there from before, and there is, as long as it's related to health, it's okay, and the health ministry tries to assist. But there is this kind of drop in people going there, which the organizations are also trying to work towards improving it, because it also increases other types of vulnerability. It is difficult to say what will be the outcome. As Camila says, now it has been, we're in August, it has been a few months since we're with them, whether the situation has been worse, and what the organizations are truly able to do to access the community. Because what we felt, at least in the field from the first survey and this survey, is that part of the community has become even more withdrawn and difficult to access, and not wishing to present themselves as part of the community. And one of my suspicions is that if the person is just poor, not a poor LGBT person, probably they will have more chances of being accepted socially, of having access to some social support. And I think this tells something.
Thank you, Melissa. Did you want to add to that, Camila?
No, I think, yeah. And I think we are on time now.
Yes, so I see that we have a question or a comment from Alan Sosa. I was thinking maybe, Alan, that you could ask the question yourself. If you're we'll just, Anya, can you make him? So you will get that question from Alan in a minute. I will just say, before I give the word to Alan, that Adrian is going to do a survey and a broader investigation into conditions for LGBT people and sex workers in Uganda. And I would like to ask Camila and Carmelisa, what would be is there any advice that you would give Adrian while there is still, while he can still change? Is there something that you would have done differently? Because of course he has in your questionnaire and everything. Is there something you would have done differently if you were to do it again? So that is for the final comment from you. But Alan, can you are you allowed to speak now? Alan Sosa, speaking from Malawi, I think. So, if not, I think we will take the advice to Adrian first, and then we'll come back to Alan. Do you have any advice? What would you have done differently if you were to do the survey again?
I think, as Camila said, if we have a notion of where the violence happens, that we sort of, and we really want to know about this, we sort of maybe sacrifice certain aspects of the questionnaire and probe a little bit more on that. If Alan is going to do it by phone, Adrian is going to do it by phone, we need to be mindful of how many questions we have. So how we formulate the increase in violence, and to make sure that the perception of violence, so probing around these other types of violence, that are known to happen maybe would be interesting to add. Another thing is make sure that the people who are going to do the survey are not just activists, but members of the community, either sex workers themselves or LGBT people. Because if the community is withdrawing and is fearful, they are not going to trust, no matter how much you're saying that you're a friend, you're an activist, you work with them, they are not going to accept to talk to you. And third, I think it is important, we try to do it free, and based our sample, we based it on a snowball that people would tell us who else to call. And in the end, what happened is that lesbians disappeared from the survey. And so make sure that your sample is purposeful, that you want X number of gay people, X number of trans men, trans women, lesbians. Bisexuals usually come into it in the midst of this, but make sure otherwise there are certain groups you won't be able to do. If possible, I find that our sample of 100 was not enough. I think we should have had a little bit more. So if possible to increase a little bit, that would also be good. You don't need to increase so much, maybe by 20, 50, but that will give you, because there's so much diversity and you want to have enough examples to analyze.
So thank you, Camila. Do you want to add to that, Camila?
The only, on the questions, I think that, again, because it's a phone interview or in these conditions, you have to be super aware of the length of the questionnaire. But to ask, in the case of, I mean, we asked for what are the most difficult prevention measures to take with the COVID, and they say stay at home, but we didn't ask, I mean, why this is, for example, that kind of questions could give you more content and to take some of the things on violence and that, because we ask for why in other questions, and that give a lot of the content and allow us to understand better. So that kind of things that, you can ask also.
So can you, if we can't connect with Alan, so maybe you can just read out the question, Anya.
In the case of Malawi, one issue that is emerging is the intersection of LGBT issues, transgender discrimination particularly, and albinism. There is unanimous agreement that persons with albinism must be protected, yet the public rhetoric seems to reject similar protection for LGBT people. Recently, a transgender with albinism has given an interview on popular private radio station. The interesting question here is whether public rhetoric will support the individual's protection or not, and whether the public will make reservations based on sexuality. From a strategy point of view, whether this is an opportunity for advocacy in terms of research, this is a reminder to pay attention to intersecting vulnerabilities and how they relate to existing sexual minority and navigating opportunities and threats to human rights protection.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you, Alan, for that question. I think I wanted you to take this into account when you make your final remarks for this session, because we're drawing to a close. So do you want to start, Adrian?
Yes. That's interesting, and it's something that we really think about, the issue of intersectionalities. We just identify people as LGBT, perhaps sex workers, but that's not where it is. There's so many intersecting issues that we need to think about, and that's something, again, that I'm going to pick up for the survey that I'm going to do. And thank you a lot, Camila and Camila, for the advice on how to do the survey better. I think that's very helpful. Good enough. The sample I'm going to use is 120 for LGBT and 120 for sex workers. Maybe we shall discuss that and see if it will be enough. And also regional balance with different regions. It's not just the center in Kampala here. We also have to, we are looking at different districts in the north, in the east, and the south of Kampala, just to kind of have the voices coming in from the different places. But I hear you on the point of the subgroups. Let us look at the subgroups and see that each of them actually is represented, their voices are being heard. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And final word from you, Camila.
Not much to say, and thank you. Nice to see you, Adrian, at this first Zoom. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thanks, Camila.
It's weird.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Camila?
I think that the question that Ellen posed was fantastic and about intersectionality and sort of comes from the discussion today. I think one of the challenges that we have is that we are not accessing the diversity of LGBT people. We end up, for example, in our case, we were working only with Maputo in the first survey. And now when we did the second survey, we tried to get people from other parts of the country, and it was difficult to access them. And we are not yet sure, but I think it's because if we're talking about networks, the people in Maputo have their networks in Maputo. And so accessing this diversity, for example, the divide between rural and urban, or other cities outside the capital, or smaller cities, also accessing the LGBT, the privileged LGBT is difficult. The issue of albinism in Mozambique is, I think, is not as serious as in the other countries of the region, but it is an issue, especially in the rural areas. And so it would be very interesting to know whether, the intersection causes more problems or protection in case one of the aspects protects and in relation to others. I have heard, for example, that there are ways in the rural areas in which LGBT is incorporated within sort of ontologies, local ontologies, and these have not been explored. So there is a vast world to explore that would be necessary, and I think that it's definitely a challenge that we should pick up on us and try and get out of this usual circle we have been in.
Thanks, Carmelisa. A lot of very good reflections. I just wanted to say, give a little bit of context on the issue of albinism in Malawi, because this was a big issue before the election last year. That there was an international outcry that Malawi was not protecting its the people with albinism, and that these were being used by political actors for what's called muti, but like witchcraft, to make them more powerful politically. So this was a big issue. So there has been a lot of support for people with albinism in the public sphere in Malawi. So I think that this sort of cross pressure, when you need to sort of protect certain groups and then suddenly they become part of a group that is also criminalized. How do we deal with that? We see a little bit similar in Norway, actually, with regard to immigration, because there is super strict immigration policies, but at the same time you want to protect LGBT people who come and who are persecuted for their sexual identity. So how do you align that in terms of policy? And it's interesting to look at those intersections as well. But of course, we've been talking about intersections of class and sexual orientation, for instance, and you brought up sex work and sexual orientation, and there are a lot of different intersectionalities that you're exploring and that the wider project is also exploring. And thank you for bringing it up. But I also think that what you've done and what is really useful and interesting is that you've also shown the practical problems of doing research in a context of pandemic. The importance of it, how do we get at this knowledge that we need with regard to who is being most affected, how are people being affected, and to get sort of better and more sound knowledge about that, but at the same time, how much more difficult it is to do it in a context where you can't move freely, where people are affected in different ways by the general pandemic situation and by the political response and legal response to it. There's a lot more to say. Our time is up, but it has been a pleasure. So thank you so much, all of you.